Welcome, everyone. I'm here to speak about the world, and this is going to be probably a two-part series where I'm looking at the transit of 2025 and 2026, even beyond, to analyze the trends of what may be happening on a political level and general world power dynamics. So in my first video, I analyze the 2025 trends just to familiarize with the energy and to know what is coming up. Where are the eclipses and the important ingresses of 2025 with a greater focus on the first 6 months because it's so packed. So please review that um, to have a broader perspective and then be able to follow the current video in greater details and understanding. For those of you who are listening to this just without really learning astrology or knowing too much about it, I do recommend signing up for a beginner's programs. This way, you don't need to be a professional, but it gives you the foundation so you understand this knowledge, the language, and you can follow, this type of video with greater, I would say, comfort or ease. So it's an important language to learn, having some basics. And I know we learn, tidbits from the internet and what is free, but having a better organized program will be immensely helpful. This is not just for absolute beginners, even those who have already some background in astrology have found this to be really invaluable. So, as we move into the new administration in the United States, Donald Trump was sworn in on January 20th. We're just a few days after. And we're going to look at what is happening in this administration. We're also going to look at the people he appointed, and then a little bit on the global dynamics. However, that is going to be more into the second part, where we're going to look at other leaders. So this first video is mostly about Trump and everything that is going to happen during, his administration from an astrological point of view. Now, politics it's a divisive subject. So we all have our attachments, and ideologies. It's pretty much the same as a religion. So I understand if some of the things I say, trigger people. We all have our biases. You know, I'm not claiming to be above that, but I do think it's worth looking into the astrology and, try to be as open as possible. At the same time, know that we do have our values and convictions. So if this really rubs you the wrong way, no hard feelings. You don't need to try to convince me of my views or what I think on the chat. Let's just say hello and goodbye to each other. That's perfectly honorable. Um, the thing I do want to say is that I think it's, you know, many astrologers avoid the subject of politics because it's so charged. So I think we need to talk about it. It's a good learning experience astrologically to begin with, but also it's part of life. So, having said that, we can begin our session. And as I said, this is a very interesting time astrologically. A lot is going on now. There is a war going on with the Ukraine and Russia. There's a lot of tension with Taiwan and China. There's obviously, a huge trauma and a lot of destruction and animosity between the Israelis and the Palestinian. And yet now the hope of a ceasefire that seems to be holding for a few days, but we'll look at that as well as we unpack those dynamics. And as I said, my first step in this exploration will be to look at the new administration. So many things will unfold in the coming weeks, in the coming months. The things that I'm highlighting here are the things we know, but new fires will start and old fires will die. So this is not set in stone, obviously. It will be very interesting, to see where we are going. So to look, first of all, before we dive into the present and the future, I do want to look back at the election themselves. That is, Trump winning this sweeping victory, hopefully, all ethical and no shenanigans behind the scenes. And when we had our panel, our election panel, where several astrologers, talked about election results, some, predicted Trump, such as Orner Doser and Bill Meridian, and some of us leaned toward Kamala. Now, it was very tight astrologically. And I just want to look back and learn, now that we know the results, what happened in the chart of Kamala. So when I look at, we look at transits, solar arcs, eclipses, um, equinox charts, and progressions. So Kamala showed a lot of strength. This is her solar arc, which is showing basically that all the planets have moved to exactly sextile the natal chart. So the solar arc is a system that moves 1 degree approximately per year. So she's 60. She was 60 in October. And so all the planets moved about 60 degrees forward, which is a critical time in a person's life from a solar arc point of view, because all the planet sextile the natal planet. So the solar arc sextile the natal, and this is usually a massive milestone. Beyond that, the solar arc sun at 28 Sagittarius was on the midpoint between Sun Saturn, which is a leadership signature. So this is positive. It doesn't show defeat. However, because 2024 was a big year for her anyway, the fact that she became the nominee and that she raised so much money and that she became kind of this hope and, the one who could, defy Donald Trump, put her in that spotlight in a way, that was significant and never happened before for her. So in any case, 2024 was a powerful year for her. And this solar arc reflects that. Now, how do we know if this includes winning the actual elections or not? We cannot know. We need other measurements. And that's why, looking at her solar return, this is the chart of her birthday. So the sun returns to the natal position, and we cast the chart for that, in Washington, because that's where she lives and where all the action is. And so this chart started in a way on her birthday, which was October 20th, 2024. So this was after the nomination, really before the election. And it's a very prominent chart. The sun, solar return, is on her MC in the 9th house. It's Capricorn rising, which also show governance. So yes, there are challenges, right? Mars squares the sun, and from the 7th house opposes Pluto. So we see it's a big battle. But it's definitely not showing a clear defeat at all. So I am, in a way, looking back and looking at these methods, and there are other techniques such as profections and, like I said, secondary progressions. And none of them are completely blunt about the results in a way. And so to me, this was very confusing. Either there's something about her birth time that's not accurate, because this chart does not show defeat at all. It may not show winning the elections, but it doesn't show what happened, that it was overwhelmingly against her. Now, this is something I personally also worked with, and what I'm trying to say is that I never really fully trusted solar return charts. I thought they were too abstract and didn't give us precise information. And this confirms it. I can't rely on this. If I were to rely on this solar return, it kind of led me wrong. So, in a way, I will say the most powerful measurements are going to be transits. It's one of the best techniques. And transit is looking at the planet alignment at the time of the event compared to the natal chart. And so we look at Donald Trump's victory election, that kind of big return. And one of the main factors, the planet Jupiter, which has to do with expansion and growth, is on his north node, on his sun, and Venus on the opposite side. So I was kind of debating, is that Jupiter going to seal the deal? And it did. I mean, after the fact, it's clear the moment Jupiter got into Gemini, which was around June 2024, until the time of the election, he was on an upspring. And all his court cases were dropped, and he had to pay a fine, and somebody kind of gave him the billions, and so he got all this amazing support, saving the assassination attempts, which you may say it's not so positive, but he came out of that relatively clean. And so that Jupiter played in a classic sense as a good fortune, an expansive and ego-boosting energy. Now, some traditional astrologer will say, well, Jupiter in Gemini is in detriment because it's the opposite sign of where it's domicile. It's ruling Sag, and it's in the opposite side, so it's not a good Jupiter. Well, reconsider because it's a very, very good Jupiter for this guy. And retrograde, not retrograde, it worked. It was a booster. Along with that, he had Uranus on his MC, which is part of, the agenda that he is bringing. And so I just want to reflect on these dynamics and revisit some of our analysis so we may learn from the results. So I want to say Jupiter is not always going to guarantee success. In some cases, it's a harsh truth. It's not a pleasant truth. But because Jupiter rules his south node and in his moon, he's born on an eclipse, it played in his favor for sure. So that, is looking back and now moving into the present. We look at, first of all, what are the coming cycles? So I spoke about this in the 2025 video, which I really encourage you to view and review because there's tons of information there that you need to distill. Pluto is in Aquarius, and it's going to stay there for 20 years. It just firmly moved into Aquarius end of 2024. And like I said, it's a 20-year cycle. The nodes, 18 months cycle, just move to Pisces and Virgo. They were in Aries and Libra, and now there are 29 Virgo Pisces. Now, that degree, 0 Aries, 29 Pisces, is the degree that begins the zodiac. So it's an inception degree, which brings something very new. Now, we're going to look at that Neptune is also conjunct the North Node. So the ruler of the North Node is on the North Node. And one of the immediate reflection of that was the ceasefire signature between Hamas and Israel. Because the Aries, what was before, is more defiant. It's all about standing up for yourself and not giving in, whereas Pisces is more pacifying. It's kind of this oceanic unifying principle. So the fact that there was a relaxing of that, hard stance and muscle is part of this change of nodal signature, which will be for the next 18 months until the middle of 2026. Not with Neptune. Neptune is there just for a few weeks. And it is an amazing opportunity to soften, the harsh stance. And so how does that play out with Trump's agenda, which is so radical and, firm in cutting and readjusting and signing, all his executive orders? When you have such a soft energy in the sky, we will explore that. The great conjunction of Saturn and Neptune is building up. It will be coming together in June, July 2025, so in 6 months, and then again in February 2026. So this is one of the most important conjunction. Happens every 37 years. And it's going to happen on that inception degree of 0 Aries. So they're both in Pisces now, a gathering towards that meeting in Aries. And please watch the other videos and article on my website about, unpacking what this means for us and for our world. Because the previous time they were together was 1989, 1990, where the world map was completely redefined. The whole Soviet Union dissolved. This is how big this gets. So go to my website, go to articles, and you'll see other great articles, but this one will also lead to a video if you haven't seen it yet. So this is the game changer for the world and for this administration as well. In July, the planet Uranus will also move into a new sign, which will be Gemini. And this really works in tandem with Pluto in Aquarius, because Uranus rules Aquarius. They're both moving to air signs, which has to do with new ideas, acceleration, AI, the crypto world, and space travel. So all the kind of scientific advances are going to be really interesting in the coming cycle of that. Contrasting a lot of these energies is the planet Jupiter, which kind of brought Trump his victory, is moving now into the sign of Cancer. It's one of the only feminine sign. All the fire, air are masculine signs, and this is a feminine presence. Jupiter represents wisdom. So we are in a time where there's a lot of testosterone coming back. And we see this with Trump's victory. We see this through the statements from Mark Zuckerberg, who said that he wants to kind of come back to a more masculine approach, whatever that means. So, the Trump administration really galvanizes this testosterone, firm, expansionism, energy. And yet Jupiter in Cancer and the North Node in Pisces are the softening energies that can bring some balance or polarization. Now, remember, when Trump, comparing the two different Trump administration, 2016, inaugurated in 2017, people were really shocked on the one hand, a lot of protests. And now everybody's giving him money. So he's kind of turned, the tables and turned things around for himself, where he's sought after and everyone kind of admires or wants, a part of his dominion. And that is also part of that masculine, feminine interplay. It's interesting that he's the only candidate, who was, representing the masculine so strongly, because he has Mars on his ascendant in Leo. I mean, talk about testosterone. And he ran for 3 times, and he lost against another man. He won against 2 women. So there's a clear masculine, feminine energy, tension in what he represents. And we see this, in facts where the Republican Party, is definitely not advancing women's right. But it will be interesting to see when there's one, side of the pendulum swinging so strongly. The Biden administration, um, opened the borders more to immigrants and gave many Venezuelan path to citizenship and, fought against the reversal of Roe and Wade for abortion rights, and then um, tried to advance the minority, including LGBTQ movements, things that are now going to be in question. Is how is this going to unfold? I know what is going to happen with minority groups. So back in his previous administration, Trump, on the one hand, came also very firmly, and that's something that we can definitely honor him for, is that he stands up for what he believes in and he fulfills his promises. People often say, well, let him talk, big talk. But he's not the type of Gemini to just talk. He's the type of Gemini that also immediately takes executive action. He's not waiting. That's part of the good and the bad of Mars on the ascendant, is that you get things done. And so when he says he's going to deport people and build a wall, he means it. It's not just threats or empty threats. And it's part of his agenda. And again, to his credit, he's honest about it. He's not coming with hidden agendas. He's very blunt, and we know where we stand with him. Like him, don't like him, it's another debate. But he is not passive aggressive. He is not saying one thing and doing the other. For the most part, you kind of knowing where you stand. And the responsibility is on the voters, because you can't say I didn't know, or you cannot say, um, I hope he doesn't do that, even though I vote for him. He is going to follow through. It doesn't mean he will succeed. It doesn't mean there won't be lawsuits and resistance. But as far as he's concerned, he means it. And what happened in his previous administration is, when you had both huge movements that were, in a way, countercultural to his administration. One of them was Me Too, which kind of blew up the end of 2017, which was all about the abuse of men in position of extreme power. It started with Hollywood directors, but spread to, pretty much every public figure and big industries. So you saw kind of the counter cultural movements of women reclaiming their power. And then another form of male dominant abuse of power was the George Floyd killing, which led to the Black Lives Matters movement. Again, a feeling of discrimination under a strong patriarchal dominion. And so these two movements were a reaction, in a way, to the strong stance, to you know, the strong male dominant culture that is often associated with Trump. And so it's going to be interesting to look forward into what's happening in the current and new administration, as he is going forward with his plans. If this Jupiter in Cancer and other alignment, which I'm going to unpack, we are headed towards, on the one hand, magnificent times, and on the other hand, crazy and scary times. So fasten your seatbelt by all means. The inauguration chart. So this is the time where he was sworn in, 1201 to be more precise, but it's pretty close to that. Now, I don't know how much weight that chart will have, but I do want to look at it because it is the beginning. Every moment like that is kind of the birth chart of a period of time that represents his new 4-year administration. So he's, sworn in with Mars retrograde. Will this impact the whole administration or just the time that Mars will be retrograde? It's going to turn direct in February. Is this a sealing moment that defines the administration? This is something we still have to learn and see. I have not done enough research to look at, previous inaugurations to be sure of that. But here we are. So when Mars is retrograde, it's on an angle. Any planet on an angle is a dominant planet. So here, Mars retrograde opposing the sun shows constant defiance. The sun is the ruler, is the king. So when Trump was in the opposition during the Biden administration, that retrograde played in his favor because he was the defiant. He was the one, the renegade, the rebel, charging against whoever was leading. But now he's the sun, and that Mars is suddenly the opposition party. Also, Mars represents the soldier when the sun represents the king or queen. So whoever's leading doesn't always have the support of their own soldiers, which is going to be interesting to see how that plays out. The other thing with Mars retrograde is that you can be very powerful if you do things differently. If you are the change maker, many geniuses are born with Mars retrograde. So it kind of fits the agenda that Trump wants to reform and redo and rewrite the script for so many things. It's very Mars retrograde. Now, pay attention to that Mars-Sun opposition because it's going to come back. Now, some Democrats, left wingers say, oh my God, I thought that during Pluto in Aquarius, we would have an era of human rights and social justice and equality for the genders and, and moving beyond the conservative agenda of trying to come back, instill religious values and ban abortion and, single out minorities and try to curb the trans movement. This is so not Aquarian. And so, they were disappointed that saying because, he was elected, West Pluto was still in Capricorn, we still have this old school patriarchal movement. But, it's very subjective. If you speak to Republicans who voted or whoever voted for him, they do see Trump as a progressive, as someone who is bringing the Aquarian paradigm forward because he is, in their view, dismantling the old guard and the career politician. And he's kind of this businessman, coming into politics and changing the rules. And on his side, You have, space, um, and advanced technology geek, Elon Musk, who wants to go to Mars, who has electric cars. And so, the contrast is pretty interesting that Trump, on the one hand, in his last administration promoted coal, and now he has an electric car manufacturer as one of his main donors and kind of right hand. So it's very Aquarian, going to space, wanting to expand into new technology and new is very Aquarian. The other thing is that he really advances the cryptocurrency movement. We know how Bitcoin soared, when he was elected. And Trump has his own currency, and Melania is a new cryptocurrency. And so this is very Aquarian. So if you ask the Republican, he is that Pluto in Aquarius movement of change, of bringing new dynamics and dismantling old school politics, and wanting, of course, to reform the FBI and so forth. Now, the sun is conjunct Pluto, so the king, the leader, is very tied to this Pluto, and Pluto in Aquarius, you have to understand, doesn't just bring progress or scientific development, but it also brings the risk of the shadow. So it kind of blow the doors open into this new era, but it also brings, all the ghosts and risks and limitations. So it is going to be an interesting exploration of, yes, we want to go to space, but be careful what you're asking for, says Pluto. You want to unleash the cryptocurrency spirit. It's going to be hard to put it back in the bottle if it's out. So there is both light and shadow, and light is the sun, shadow is Pluto. Now, how are they going to work together? You can expect a lot of the destructive side of progress and technology, and whereas, we will see if all the reforms that Trump is instigating will bring a better, more unifying, a more advanced civilization, or if it will burn the house down. Will there be renewal, or will there be destruction? And Trump is a Uranian guy. His sun is conjunct Uranus on the North Node. And if you look at Vance's chart, Uranus is on the South Node. Uranus also represents the party because it has to do with the group mentality. So what party you're part of. So when you see the Sun Pluto conjunction, there may also be, who's part of the group, who's in, who's out. And you see the Bezos and the Zuckerberg wanting to be part of the club, Aquarius, giving $1 million to this inauguration. Other ways that Trump is kind of bringing this Aquarian vision is by bringing Robert Kennedy to the Health and Human Service Department. And Robert Kennedy is wanting to change the way the health system is conducted, and the whole controversy around vaccines and whether they're good or not. And so that's very Aquarian. It's questioning the status quo. So whether it's your type of Aquarian or not, it's not the question. It is very Aquarian. He does bring that Pluto in Aquarius, a new perspective on how to address new problems and old problems. Will it work? We'll see. The other thing that's really interesting in this inauguration is this conjunction, like I talked about, the nodes just moving to Pisces, conjunct Neptune, the ruler. Venus is approaching that. Saturn is approaching that. So we have a cluster on the North Node, which again, I talked about in that other video. And this is a very softening energy, especially Venus, Neptune on the North Node, which, like I said, is conducive to actually put the guns down, to soften. And it's interesting, right, that as Trump is inaugurated, you have this bishop lady, interfaith minister, who asks for compassion. So she addresses the new administration and Trump and speaks about the fact that the immigrants are scared and the LGBTQ community are scared, and to consider their plight. And so that's a very Venus Neptune attempt to soften his stance and to bring some compassion. And he was not happy about that at all. So she got the nasty label. But that is part of this movement, of this coming weeks of energy moving on the North Node. Now, with Saturn Venus, Saturn Venus is very important here, and it is part of Trump's natal signature. He's born on a Saturn Venus, so it's a recurrence. And that speaks a lot about him speaking with Musk about efficiency and curbing the debt, the national debt. And what will it take? So Saturn is austere, is trying to control and limit. Venus has to do with expanses, financial systems, and materialism in general. How do we bring things into form, into matter? So this kind of does reflect the agenda of contraction, of economic contraction. The nodes in Virgo Pisces speak about employment, services, employment. So the whole employment industry. Will the fact that many posts and offices are going to be suspended or eliminated and people are going to lose their jobs, is that going to backfire? Is that going to work out well? It's left to see. It depends how it's done. Like, we have to remember that when businessmen come to lead a country, whether they are the leaders or they work with the leader, and Musk is a businessman, Trump is a businessman, they suddenly have to realize that you can't fire people in your country that you don't like. You can't always run a country like a business because you don't have the same freedoms as you have in your business. When you're not pleased with a worker, you can fire them in your business. But when you're not pleased with your citizens, you cannot fire them. They are always going to be US citizens. So you suddenly have to be the president of all those you like and those you don't like, which is a very Neptunian thing. It's part of the maturity of Neptune that you don't choose your clients, you don't choose your citizens. You have to understand the diversity of what makes a country. So that kind of executive order and wanting to sort things out efficiently may be a nice idea in a corporation. It may not translate so well in a business where you can't just eliminate homeless people. You cannot just eliminate people, who don't work as hard as you would like them to work. They are there and they're going to stay. So will this lead to a labor force crisis, to unemployment spikes? And how harsh is it going to be, that Saturn Venus? The other thing to consider along with that is Jupiter is in Gemini. Jupiter has to do with expansion, but also with foreign countries, international relations. So it both has to do with neighbors, Mexico, Canada, and Russia on the Alaska side. It also has to do with multiculturalism. And obviously, it has everything to do with immigrants. So the previous time Trump was in office in 2000, excuse me, just before he came into office, 2015 and 16, we had the similar configuration with the nodes reversed in Virgo Pisces and Neptune on the south node. And we had a massive wave of Syrian immigrants flooding, the European borders, leading to the backlash of Brexit and the backlash of Trump's election. So the right wing beefed up because the left, allowed for this migration of massive amounts of people. So we see kind of a similar scenario now as Jupiter moves into Gemini. It will square Saturn and Venus, and there you have the financial sanction, the tariffs. Can't export without heavy wages and fares. So Jupiter is that import-export. Saturn, Venus is the financial restrictions, financial borders. So beefing up those borders. How will that fly? And then, of course, the whole issue of deportation of these immigrants is also going to be really interesting and play out, I suspect, in the very first weeks of the administration as Jupiter squares Saturn. Jupiter is the immigrants in Gemini coming from diverse, different countries, different religions, different backgrounds, walking on foot, Gemini, and then the square to Saturn can come in revoking. Mars retrograde in Cancer also speaks of uprooting. So people being evicted from their homes. The same way the fires in Los Angeles, uprooted people from their homes. We can anticipate that with this Mars in Cancer, retrograde and then direct, there's going to be a lot of plucking and people, pulled out of their homes. That definitely brings a lot of the themes that we know about in focus. There are things that will emerge that we don't know yet about. which are going to be interesting to see. Another thing I want to highlight is that there's no fire energy in this chart, except for Chiron in Aries. So fire is Leo, Aries, Sag. Now, Trump is a very fiery person. He has Leo rising, Mars in Leo, Sag moon. So we know how extroverted he is, how doesn't mince his words. So the fire energy is creative, it's outspoken, it's very raw, it's very wild, it's very testosterone, and it's very much action oriented. So having no fire in the inauguration chart doesn't really reflect Trump's nature so harmoniously. Now we look at the planets that rule the fire signs. Mars for Aries is retrograde in a water sign. The sun ruling Leo is in Aquarius, conjunct Pluto. And Jupiter ruling Sag is in Gemini square Saturn. All these placements are actually considered traditionally as detriment and fall by sign. I don't necessarily use so much the detriment and fall. I don't think it's as valid as I mentioned. He won the election with that Jupiter, but it's still interesting to kind of consider the fact that all the fire planets and no are in these watered down signs, and there's no fire representation except for Chiron. And so that's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. That Mars also, in Cancer squares the ruler of Cancer, the moon, and opposes Mercury, the ruler of the South Node. So it's going to be emotional for sure. Whether the job and labor force plans are going to support having jobs, or is it going to leave a vacuum when there's no labor force because they're either being fired or people losing their job, or the deportation of a massive amount of people who, were working. So that Virgo Pisces is going to be part of this dynamic. And Venus being in Pisces is great for compassion. It's great for also simplifying systems because it dissolves complications. But it's not a very practical Venus. From an economic standpoint, people with Venus in Pisces are not that good at managing their resources. Because Pisces is a more abstract spirit-related sign. It's about the free spirit. It's not about, wanting to set money aside for college. So it's a very optimistic Venus that can really believe everything's going to be fine. And it rules that Uranus in Taurus, which speaks about, let's change the economic system. But will it lead to betterment, or will it lead to a quicksand, Pisces? Will the economy flounder? Let's wait and see. It all depends on if the good ideas are implemented in a responsible, conscious way, or if it's done, carelessly, recklessly, which is always a risk with Pisces, because Pisces is not a very disciplined, not very rigorous sign. So I hope this makes sense. Now, I want to add some interesting asteroids. So asteroids are these small rocks, usually placed between Mars and Jupiter, and they're named after people, places, things, seemingly randomly. But when we actually place them in the wheel, they often reveal very specific information that we can really narrow down to uh, particular issues. For the example I recently had was there's an asteroid that was named after Judy Foster after she made her movie Contact. So they named an asteroid after her. And it happens to be that she was born exactly with her sun conjunct that asteroid. That's kind of the synchronicity, the crazy synchronicities that happen with these asteroids. So I added to the inauguration charts the asteroid Israel, asteroid Palestrina. So there's no Palestine asteroid, but there's one that's named Palestrina, which is the closest. When you don't have an exact name, you choose something that kind of has the same family, is within the same name family. China, Taiwan, asteroid Zelensky, and asteroid Russia. So China and Russia are on the ascendant of the inauguration. What does that mean? Close to that Uranus. Will they play a part in this economic changes? We'll see. Asteroid Zelensky, leader of the Ukraine, is on Mars, 21 Cancer. And we know that Trump's administration is not very favorable to keep supporting, the Ukraine financially, and they want to kind of, either resolve the situation, make compromises, and so the whole question about NATO, Zelensky, the Ukraine, is in the balance. And to see the asteroid Zelensky right on the Mars of the inauguration is not so friendly for him. The asteroid Israel, on the other hand, is right on the north node of the administration, of the inauguration, conjunct Neptune. Now, that doesn't mean easy. It does mean focus, that there's a lot of focus there. And that Israel, the whole situation in the country will play a significant role in this administration. So both China, Russia on the angles, and Israel on the north node, Palestrina is not doing much. It's in the sixth house, 9 degrees Scorpio. It's trining the water planets, but it's not prominent. And Taiwan is at 13 degrees Aries, which currently is close to Chiron. But we'll see when Saturn moves into Aries. That's going to be 2026. And eventually crosses over that degree. We'll see if there's anything tickling that asteroid Taiwan. So looking at Trump, how do these asteroids play out in his natal chart? Guess what? The asteroid Taiwan is 22 Gemini, smack on his sun. The asteroid Zelensky is right on his Pluto. Well, well, well. Um, Russia natally is at 12 degrees Aries. Interestingly, the same degree of where Taiwan is now, 13 Aries. When we look at the inauguration chart, like I mentioned, Saturn-Venus conjunction is a recurrence of his natal. Mars is retrograding on his Saturn. So these coming days where Mars moves at, in the 20s of Cancer on his Saturn, there's going to be a lot of confrontation. There's going to be a lot of friction and people in the party liking him, disliking him. It's not easy energy. He will be, when Mars is kind of rubbing your Saturn, you're on the defensive and you can get upset and angry. So we can expect him to be more reactive. Jupiter is now retrograde still. It will soon go direct, but it's far from, his Gemini cluster. He was inaugurated with Moon on Jupiter. So that's kind of like this expansive energy and obviously a big moment for him where many of his entourage, celebrated his victory. So that's a very Moon Jupiter activation. Um, yeah, and Uranus back to his MC. It's stationed there. It's going to go direct very soon. So both Uranus and Jupiter are really slow now, and they're about to change direction. He also was inaugurated during this Ceres return, and Ceres has everything to do with the feminine, has everything to do with climate change. It has to do with agriculture and seasons, and the fact that he's born with a Pluto Ceres opposition does bring question about, the oppression of the female principle. Um, but yeah, a Ceres return will be interesting to see how that plays out. So, what's also interesting, we mentioned the inauguration and how Mars retrograde opposes the sun. Trump himself is a very Mars person with Mars angular on his ascendant. And his sun at 22 Gemini is exactly on the United States Mars. So United States Mars is 21 Gemini. His sun is 22 Gemini. And that's why he's such an agitator. That's why there's so much division around and controversy around him. Because he's such a Martian person who can trailblaze, who has, limitless amounts of energy and wants to move things forward, but constantly, starting fires and lawsuits and calling, people nasty and that whole power struggles that are always following him is part of this Mars energy. So it makes him this fighter and this ability to resurrect himself and to never give up. He never gave up the fight, which is this powerful Mars energy, but it's also setting everything in on fire. An implosion. So the duality, it's both the good side and the problematic sides. But when we look at his administration, the new appointees, pay attention to Mars placements and the sun. Pay attention to Saturn, Neptune. So we mentioned that we are entering an era of a Saturn-Neptune conjunction, which will dominate during Trump's administration from middle of 25 into the following couple of years. They're currently together in Pisces, Saturn, Neptune. So this new cycle is a game changer. And now when we look at the people he appointed, Christine Nome, and some of them are not confirmed, so things may change. But if it does go according to plan, they will be part of this new administration, which is likely because, it's very rare for someone not to be passing the scrutiny, even though it's a tedious process. Anyway, she's the Homeland Security appointee, and her sun is in Sagittarius, square Mars. Saturn in Gemini, opposing Neptune. So I mentioned Saturn, Neptune aspects, Mars, Sun aspect. Proponent for the defense secretary position has a Mars, Sun square as well, and a Saturn, Neptune square as well. So a repetition of Mars, Sun, and Saturn, Neptune. So Saturn, Neptune people are normally, it's a common signature for politics. But it is particularly important now because of the conjunction. Tulsi Gabbard, National Intelligence Director of all things, she's a Mars-Sun conjunction in Aries, opposing Pluto. So she's someone to resurrect. People born with Mars-Pluto are people who die. You forget about them. They crash and burn, and then they come back to life. The phoenixes. So she's someone who's going to come back over and over again, especially as an Aries. But you see the Mars-Sun energy is very present. So she doesn't have a Saturn-Neptune aspect, at least, as far as we know from not having her birth time. So it's not in the 12th house. Now, Kash Patel, he's one of the most controversial figures. Born of Indian descent and very radical in his deep state ideology, wanting to uproot, the whole system and fire all the FBI agents. And so it's very interesting to look at his chart, as he's such a radical and intense individual who is going to be a wild card, and look at his Mars Sun opposition. So he's born during a Mars retrograde, not only retrograde, but at the peak of the retrograde because it's opposing the Sun. And his Mars is conjunct Jupiter. Now, people with Mars Jupiter, keep that in mind because we're going to talk about that aspect. But Mars Jupiter people are bulldozers. They they have such a strong willpower. They feel invincible. It's that feeling that you're unbreakable, that you're big, and that God is with you sometimes. Jupiter brings some kind of zeal and ideology and beliefs that drive your action. So when someone has faith, Jupiter, their actions are much more direct and impulsive and powerful. So that Mars Jupiter in Virgo, he intends to follow through on many things. And he's going to be very Virgo systematic about what happens first and next. Opposing the sun, we can expect polarization. We can expect him to be a wild card also in the administration, because as a good Pisces, he's going to be compliant first. He's going to do whatever, is asking of him to do. But at some point, that Mars opposition is rebellious. So how will that fly with Trump? Having Mars is the soldier, Sun is the king and queen. Will they get along long term? Left to be seen. Uranus is moving into Gemini. It's going to square this. For now, his North Node is on Trump's Mars and Trump ascendant. So he's fighting for Trump. He's defending Trump. He rallies his Mars energy to advance Trump's agenda. But Martian people flip easily. They can be a friend today, and then they become your fierce enemy in another day. A good example of Mars energies is Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Angelina Jolie, Brad Pitt, who have strong Mars connections in their charts. And, they were fighting for justice and changing, adopting children and being ambassadors of goodwill until the tables turned and they became bitter enemies. That's Mars in action. It's a wild card. On we go with Michael Waltz, National Security Advisor. Mars square the Sun. Once again, and the Moon is there as well. No immediate Saturn Neptune, but current Neptune at 28, 29 Pisces squares his Saturn for this year. So that is going to bring a lot of questions about management, integrity, and public service. Environmental Protection Agency, who is an Aquarian with Sun, Mercury in Aquarius, one of the first thing he says is that protecting the environment is not very good for business. And that his agenda is about promoting business. So you wonder why he's appointed for protecting the environment. I mean, you know why, but that's the paradox. And interestingly, he's born in the same year as Kash Patel, with that Mars Jupiter retrograde in Virgo. So you can expect him to be very effective and practical in the way he wants to do things. And again, having that kind of ideology and belief in whatever he believes in, that's what he's going to do. And it's uncompromising. He's a Saturn Neptune square as well. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who is the only or prominent openly gay representative, I believe the only one, whose Sun is at 28 Leo, right on Trump's ascendant. So here we have a Mars Sun sextile, very tight. And his Sun, 28 Leo, lands on Trump's 26 Leo Mars. Also a Saturn Neptune square. And our favorite RFK Jr. Health and Human Service appointee, which is very interesting. I mean, he's obviously very controversial with his um, views on the evils of vaccines, but also wanting to reform the pharmaceutical industry and all the lobbying that happens around that. Now, and wanting to bring also more alternative medicine into the mainstream. So these are very bold, risky moves. And I don't even know if Trump is on board with all of the things he wants to do. That famous picture of him being fed McDonald's burgers as a joke to kind of humiliate him and his health food um, ideas uh, is is kind of a sign, an omen of what may come. But as far as the chart is concerned, it's interesting. I added the asteroid Hygeia, which is the Caduceus symbol here. And Hygeia has to do with health and has to do with healing and has to do with diseases. So both can cause diseases, but can also bring the medicine. And it's interestingly on his south node with Uranus. So this whole idea of alternative Uranus, health, Hygeia on his south node means that he is definitely someone who carries that, who's identified with that. And it's all, this is a timed chart. So we have a time of birth for him, unlike the previous charts. And it's all in his 6th and 12th house, which are health related. Chiron, also related to medicine, is on his north node in the 6th house. So he's definitely, someone who can address health matters. He seems to have background in that. And I know that you know, uh, he's done studies, but it also speaks of his own health issues, neurological issues, losing his voice, um, that is his own story coming into play in the public sense. Now, he's not a Mars sun. He's one of the only one without a Mars sun aspect. He does have Neptune square everything from his 4th house. And on top of that, he's a Mars Saturn conjunction in the 4th house. Now, Mars Saturn conjunction, represents his deep grief of losing his father and his uncle in these tragic assassinations. So it's in the 4th house of family. So you see tragedy in the family. But it's also what kind of fed his radical distrust in the system. People with Saturn in Scorpio, don't trust the system. And there are usually a lot of integrity issues and ethical issues because Scorpio goes into the shadows, explores the shadows, and Saturn has to do with governance. So are we governing in transparent ways? Are we honest? Are there hidden agendas? Is there corruption? So the whole fight for corruption and the conspiracy theories of who killed, his father and his uncle, which affected the Kennedy family, so personally, is part of his upbringing and conditioning. And he's now, very much anti-establishment and speaks against the system, and it wants to expose the corruption. So will he expose the corruption in a successful way? what will happen when he exposes Trump's issues and integrity problems? His Mars at 16 Scorpio lands, on Trump's own Pluto, Saturn at 8 Scorpio square, Trump's Pluto at 10 Leo. So will they get along? It's left to see. Now keep that degree in mind, 8 degrees Scorpio, because we're going to come back to it. Now Jupiter is going to move into Cancer, as we said, and that's going to be a time where he will implement all the things he wants to implement. So we see that by the end of 2025, as Jupiter is towards the end of Cancer, on his Uranus, on his Aegea, a lot of that will be set in motion. The big player Musk with Vivek Ramaswamy, who are both appointed as government efficiency agents, officers. I don't know what's the term, but they are supposed to basically save money because the government spends too much money on inefficient management of labor force. So they're going to come with their business guns and tidy up the whole place. But as we look at both of them, Vivek is the inner wheel and Musk is the outer wheel. So Vivek has a Mars-Sun conjunction. Once again, it's a timed chart, and so we don't see here Neptune Saturn, but we do see Neptune in Capricorn, which is a Saturn sign. Musk has the Saturn's Neptune opposition on Vivek's moon, and Musk has Mars on his North Node, which happens to oppose Vivek's Sun, Mars. So you can bet these two are going to implode. When you have strong Mars relationships, and oppositions are the harshest one to deal with, you can become fierce enemies. But there's a way to mitigate that. And it's going to be up to them to see if they manage to make it work. When you have strong Mars energies, you need an enemy. You need a villain. So as long as they have a goal, they can work together, use their Mars energy towards that goal. But the moment they start to disagree on how to, tackle this issue, it can turn against each other. So, we can suspect that in the beginning, there's going to be a lot of action and a lot of good enthusiasm and passion. But Musk's Saturn on Vivek's moon, he's going to try to control him, tell him what to do. Vivek's Saturn squares his Sun and Musk's Mars, which is kind of putting a brake on the gas pedal. Mars is the gas, Saturn is the brake. So another kind of power struggle, what to do, how to do, when to do. And yeah, it looks contentious. So you see that as the administration starts with a Sun-Mars opposition, fires burning in the West, snow in Florida, extremes are showing up. Polarization is showing up. And all his administration is kind of following that theme of Mars, Sun, energy. And so they're all eager to just, let's go and do it. Let's lift our sleeves and get to work. But it also means everyone is very temperamental. It's reactive energy. It's aggressive energy. It's that testosterone that we keep speaking about. So just keep that in mind as we watch the news and as we basically see the trends of what happens with the administration. As I was describing in my 2025 video, the year begins with a lot of water energy. All this Pisces, Mars in Cancer, and retrograding, so it stays there for many weeks. And water energy is not direct. It's not something that, is conducive to overt, firm action. It brings a lot of vulnerabilities. The vulnerability of the leaders and the vulnerability of the people. So coming strong with a Mars retrograde climate is a little bit against the zeitgeist. There's a saying that if you start a war during Mars retrograde, the one who initiates it loses it. The one who is responding has better chances. So it's kind of a David and Goliath myth of Mars retrograde, where the least expected to win actually wins. So that is part of the agenda here. Is there's a lot of what's least expected to happening with Mars retrograde. Now, a lot of water also affects the first part of the year from January, at least into April. April is kind of a transition time between this abundance of water. All the eclipses are in Pisces. So it's all on that 29-degree Pisces, and Venus retrogrades from Aries to Pisces. Only later will this water clear out and the fire is going to be ignited. Now, if we look at future, upcoming cycle, this is the first lunar eclipse of the administration. And bear in mind that Trump is born on a lunar eclipse. So the sun and moon opposition, the natal chart is the center. The eclipse is happening March 14th, 2025. So it's a full moon on the nodal axis. He's born with it, and so he's more responsive to lunar eclipse cycle because it's his own. But on top of this lunar eclipse happens to square pretty tightly his own lunar eclipse. It conjuncts the planet Saturn, which will square his sun. So Saturn is again both the incentive to implement firm boundaries, to say, stop the immigration, cut the jobs, put the tariffs on, it's all these executive orders of radical, firm policies, attempting to curb what was initially loose. So we can see that that's happening. We can see that it's affecting jobs in Virgo Pisces, and that there is going to be a lot of people laid off. But we also see opposition to his agenda, because it's in his 7th house, which has to do with the other person, with the other party. And we can expect that as he comes, with a firm agenda, that there are going to be lawsuits and a massive movement of lawyers from environmental agencies, from immigration agencies, from whatever, you know, um, group of people feeling discriminated against are going to react. So this whole period of time between now and the eclipse, mid-March into April, Trump is not free. There's a lot of water. It squares his sun, and Jupiter is not coming to the rescue just yet. So we can expect many setbacks and many, I would say, delays in what he wants to do. There's going to be a lot of that gas brake, moving forward full force, and then having, things, people, circumstances stopping him. At least that's what comes across. So that lunar eclipse, I talked about it for your personal use. See where it lands in your chart from the 2025 video. So I want to speak about how, this is a difficult start, but then as Jupiter advances into Gemini in May, late April and May, he's going to get his surge back. That Jupiter has been very favorable for him. So we can expect that if there are setbacks, eventually towards the middle of the year into May, he will score some points. He will, be able to implement some of his goals. Jupiter then moves into Cancer and very quickly kind of advances towards his own Cancer planets, which I suspect initially will be quite a support for him. And it's in the 11th house, which has to do with alliances, with party, and with, his support base. So we can see that as Mars is there, it's contentious. People, are fired and come back and rebel. But then as Jupiter comes again towards September and the end of the year, it's likely working in his favor. So now we're moving into next year and the future cycles. And again, bringing back this Saturn-Neptune conjunction, which is so central to our collective experience. So referring you back to the article and to the video for greater knowledge. That Saturn, Neptune are going to come together in Aries in 2026. And by April, it will oppose Trump's own Neptune. This is probably going to be the most difficult period, one of the most difficult period, because if we look back at history, Saturn-Neptune oppositions have brought leaders to their knees. It's the most humbling configuration and the most destabilizing configuration that can be. Not many survive it. So we're looking here at examples. Bill Clinton was brought to his knees with the Saturn-Neptune opposition, with the whole Monica Lewinsky scandal. Dominic Strauss-Kahn, who was leading, the election to become president of France and, president of the Monetary Fund, ended up exposed in a scandal with assaulting a maid in New York City, burying his political career and his business career. So he became this pariah following, the Saturn Neptune. Benjamin Netanyahu was exposed for corruption as Neptune opposed his natal Saturn. And that is part of what set in motion for him the madness that unfolded the following years. But that was the time where he was brought to his knees. So that was what led Benjamin Netanyahu to become this persona non grata. Nobody wanted to deal with him once he was convicted, for corruption. But that also set in motion the fact that in order to save himself, he had to do everything to come back in power. And he ended up in coalition with extremists, radical nationalist racists who became part of his government in 2022. And we know, the October 7 events and what happened in Gaza after that. So the radicalization of Netanyahu was nourished by his humiliation and defeat exposed in a scandal. So what will happen to Trump? It's going to be a big test. And it is in his financial houses, 2nd and 8th. So there could be something really unethical, corrupt, either about sexual issues, if that's still relevant for him, 8th house, 2nd house, or financial. Saturn is going to move relatively quickly. So from early 2026 into April, then it's kind of racing forward into the later degrees of Aries. However, Neptune is going to linger there for quite a while because it's a slower moving planet. So, he's probably going to survive it in one way or another. He's strong and he has proven, extreme resilience, but it will be likely a very significant test, and it can stain him, for the rest of his life and his image. Saturn, Neptune, you need to be so pristine and clean. You have to have such high standards to gracefully sail through that. And we know that he's such a controversial figure with, corruption everywhere. So likely there's going to be another scandal. Mars is following suit, soon after late Pisces. It squared his sun at the time, and then it's going to come on that Saturn opposed Neptune. So it's pretty intense and destabilizing. To what extent, we will live to tell. Now, later that year, 2026, Trump is having a Mars return, which, happens every 2 years. But we know that there's so much Mars energy in him, so it's worth paying attention to that. But what ends up happening, and what we need to pay attention to, is that not only is it a Mars return, but the nodes are there as well. So there's a Mars node in the sky on his Mars. Now, anything that is on the nodal axis is boosted, is on steroids. Think about October 7th, what happened in the Middle East was Mars on the South Node in Libra. And Benjamin Netanyahu is a Libra, and Israel is Libra rising. So that Mars was right on the angles of the country and the leader. So Mars is conjunct Jupiter on the South Node on Trump's Mars. That day, it happened to oppose the moon and square the sun. So there's, this momentary time of incredible intensity. It's a Mars square sun. When you see a Mars square sun, it means Mars is going to turn retrograde soon. So we're actually entering the next Mars retrograde cycle by the end of 2026. And that Mars retrograde will go 3 times, first time here, then retrograde, then forward on Trump's Mars. So he is entering this fiery phase in 2026. Now remember, November is the midterm elections in the United States. So it's a very important election to see if the party that is in power continues to receive the support of the House and Congress, and or whether he's going to have opposition. So currently, Trump has majority across the board, and it looks like the midterms, are going to be in his favor. With that Jupiter and Mars return, he is, on this unstoppable, invincible mode. It has this expansionism quality. So when the inauguration chart didn't have much fire, we now see an accumulation of fire. And Vance is a Leo. So all these Leo energies are going to also wake him up from his own sleep. But Trump is, roaring. Now, remember that as he is roaring and as he may score points, we all are going to experience Mars, Jupiter in Leo on the South Node, and it's going to affect our own charts. So that also means that all of us are going to feel this. Remember when I said Mars, Jupiter is kind of the unstoppable bulldozer? Because you come with faith and a feeling of invincibility, and you're unstoppable, you feel unbreakable. So it's that immense surge of energy that boosts your ego and create this it's a manic episode. So expansionism, to what extent is this going to go? But as this affects all of us, it can also galvanize opposition. People all over the world will have this Mars, Jupiter on the nodes. And so nobody's going to take, accepting being controlled by another. It's a statement of freedom. And my freedom, it cannot be at the expense of somebody else's freedom. So if we speak about Trump's expansionism agenda, the Panama Canal and the Greenland thing and renaming the mountains and renaming the Gulf of America, all these grandiose kind of post-colonialism desire to expand can peak in this late 2026, early 2027 period. Bear in mind that he still has this Neptune-Saturn really affecting him. So it's always dual, you know, as he pushes his boundaries with Mars-Jupiter, there are, what I'm trying to say is that there are counter movements, there are balancing forces that will try to buffer this. So what I'm saying is that we can expect all over the world, and I'm going to talk in the next video, in the part 2 of the world, we're going to talk about how this affects other leaders and other nations and maybe us. Just, you know, I'm going to get to that eventually. So 2026, now 2027, there's a total eclipse in Leo. The nodes are in Leo, right on his Pluto. And it's opposing Pluto on the north node. So Pluto's in Aquarius on the north node in Aquarius. The eclipse is in Leo opposing Pluto. And that lands on Trump's Pluto. So by 2027, he's having deep Pluto moments. And Pluto, an eclipse on Pluto could eliminate you in no time. It doesn't always happen instantly, but it can lead to betrayal, to a loss of a person, you know, in his entourage, important people. And it can lead to grief in that sense. It can also lead to, you know, his own power struggles and his own risk of health issues and risk of who knows, other assassination attempts. So this is a time where he, you know, he has to kind of rally his deepest powers and resurrect, because an eclipse on Pluto is very intense as it opposes Pluto. Now, it is also a time where if you are doing the shadow work, you know, you can rise like the phoenix. The following year, Saturn by then will move into Taurus. And as it moves into Taurus, it squares Pluto in Aquarius. So Saturn conjuncts Chiron at 8 degrees Taurus. Remember I told you, remember the 8 degree with Robert Kennedy? His Saturn is 8 Scorpio. So by transit, Saturn will conjunct Chiron at 8 degrees Taurus, square Pluto at 8 degrees Aquarius. Now, Taurus is the economy. Pluto in Aquarius has to do with all the reforms and the changes and the cryptocurrency and going to space and wanting to, you know, revolutionize everything. So we see that there's a financial contraction that can lead to a serious crisis, Pluto, destruction, Pluto. So we see that as 2026, The Mars retrograde Jupiter is so much about expansionism and invincibility. The following year is all contraction, and that's when the bill will come. Now, remember, Saturn Pluto was the cycle that brought us COVID and the pandemic from an economic point of view. So the economic contraction that happened in 2020 when all markets had to close and nobody could work, and the government had to put everybody on welfare, that's now the brainchild of that 2020 cycle. So it's happening in Taurus and Aquarius, which it's going to be a big test of whether the economy gets stronger. Saturn can bring strength and stability, or whether the economy tanks. And there's a deep global economic contraction. This will affect leaders. Remember RFK, Robert Kennedy's Saturn is 8 Scorpio. Remember Trump's Pluto is 10 Leo. So all this lands on many of these key players. And that's the chart of 2027, 2028. This is when the solar eclipse occurs on his Pluto. 9:55 to 10:02, like 5 minutes off, and Pluto is on the north node. At the same time, Trump is basically moving into his late life transits. When you reach your 80s, 81, 82, you're entering a series of cycles that are generational transits. Watch this video about the generational transits of the 40s and the 80s. So we have our midlife transition with a similar sequence of alignment, and then another one in the 80s, which means Saturn will square his Saturn, Neptune will oppose his Neptune, and Pluto will oppose his Pluto. All within, a few years, 1 to 3 years. So as Saturn moves into the 9th house, his 9th house squaring Saturn, Venus, this will be in 2027, the test of his foreign policy agenda. Will other countries defy him? Saturn in Aries, rising in the 9th house, will the tariff policies make the US stronger or not? What happens with the allies? And what happens with China? What happens with Russia? You see this Saturn is in Aries, then what we mentioned in 2028, moving into Taurus with Chiron, square his Saturn, then Pluto. So we can expect him to go through a time where all that he has implemented will be then tested. And if he's doing things wisely, it will bring the results. That Saturn brings the fruits of what you're sowing. So if your fruits are rotten, or if you prosper, it's time for accountability. This is a time for accountability. So very, very interesting dynamics. Now, another thing I want to mention with the Mars-Jupiter of 2026, remember that's kind of the expansionism and the big agendas and go big or go home type of energy on Trump's Mars in Leo, but also on Musk's, who is born with Mars on the node in Aquarius. So you remember, we know that Musk is very Aquarian, and he's very much attracted to advanced technology. So all of that energy of Mars and Trump's Mars opposes Musk's own Mars. So they have a Mars-Mars opposition. And every time Mars is in Aquarius or in Leo, these two are going to start rubbing each other's shoulders and fists. Will the bromance, lead to new adventures in space and adventures in bank accounts and greater reforms and revolutions? They could, but there's a big ego balance here to maintain. And since since Mars is going to retrograde at the end of Leo, and it's a 3 pass on Trump's own Mars, Musk will need to contain himself and will need to know how to act, because it's not always going to be according to what he wants. So will he take a step back, or will he be able to negotiate his place is left to be seen, but there are going to be sparks and big ego confrontations. And this leads us to our closing statement for this chapter. We were looking now at what we're going to explore next video, just looking at the world, how all these alignments are going to affect other leaders, and pay attention to the fact that all the big powers in the world, the United States is Cancer, Sun. Russia is Capricorn, Sun. China is Libra, Sun. And Iran, even though it's not an economic superpower, Iran stands as an entity on its own, and it is Aries, Sun. So you have all these superpowers having cardinal suns in early cardinal degrees. Russia is 3 degrees Capricorn. The US is 13 Cancer. China is 7 Libra. Iran is 11 Aries. And we have Neptune, Saturn moving into Aries, squaring the US sun and Russia's sun, and on opposing the Chinese sun. So this is not, in and of itself, Neptune, Saturn is an important cycle for the collective and for leadership. It can redraw the maps of the world. Borders is Saturn. Neptune dissolves the border, just like water washing and eroding the rocks. So there will be new borders. There will be new countries. We'll speak about the Middle East. We'll speak about the new agreements, possibly with the Saudis, what happens with India. So we're going to kind of explore politics and world dynamics. But remember, how important the fact that all these superpowers are holding a cardinal angle. And that ain't coincidence. So on this note, prayers for the best outcomes for humanity, for the earth, for human rights, for sustainability as a whole, and for astrology to continue thriving as more of you become interested. Blessings.